I'm not going to open this the way you might expect, with rage, with tears, with the kind of righteous fury that makes for good television. I'm going to open it the way it actually started, with a confession, not of guilt, not of wrongdoing, a confession of something far more common and far more dangerous. I was blind. Not the dramatic, oblivious kind of blind, not the fool who missed 100 obvious signs. I was blind the way most men who build things are blind, too focused on what's in front of them to check what's crumbling behind. My name is Sullivan, and for 15 years I built. I built Crestline Construction from a second-hand pickup truck and 2 subcontractors who occasionally showed up on time. I built it into a company with 40 employees, 3 active crews, and enough contracts to keep the lights on through a recession. Every dollar came from somewhere I dug with my own hands, early mornings, late bids, underpaying myself for years while I reinvested everything back into the work. People respect that kind of story. I used to respect it too. I built a home on the outskirts of Denver. Not a house. There's a difference most people don't bother with, but I do. A house is 4 walls and a roof. A home is the kitchen where you know which floorboard creaks, the back porch where the light hits the mountain range just right in the late afternoon, the room you turned into a study because you always told yourself you'd read more books. I knew every corner of that place. I'd personally overseen the finish work on the master bath because the contractor I'd originally hired didn't meet my standard. That's the kind of man I am, or was, or still am, depending on how you look at what came next. And I built what I believed, sincerely and without performance, was a marriage worth keeping. Her name was Natasha. I want to be careful here because I'm not bitter yet, not in this part of the story. I'll tell you who she was before I tell you who she turned out to be because she deserves that, or rather because the truth deserves it. Natasha was charming the way certain people are charming without effort, not performing warmth, just radiating it. She walked into rooms and people oriented toward her like plants toward a window. She had a real estate career she'd built with genuine skill. She understood properties the way I understood structures, from the bones outward. She had opinions and she defended them. She had a social circle I was always slightly peripheral to, not because she excluded me, but because I worked too much and showed up late to things and occasionally forgot what we were doing on Saturday until she reminded me Thursday night. We'd been married 9 years. No children, a mutual decision we'd revisited twice and arrived at the same conclusion both times. We had a rhythm. The kind of rhythm that, from the outside, looks like contentment. Sunday morning coffee on that back porch. Her shows in the evening while I reviewed bids. Dinner out most Fridays. Shared opinions on things that didn't matter. Polite navigation around a few things that did. Looking back, I can trace the fault lines. I just didn't know they were fault lines at the time. There were moments, small, easily dismissed, when she looked at me the way people look at a piece of furniture they've mentally moved past. Not with cruelty, just with the vague, settled resignation of someone who has already made a decision they haven't announced yet. She'd stopped asking about my projects with the interest she'd once had. Early in our marriage, she'd wanted to know the details, which sites, which clients, which bids we'd won. Later, it became courteous nodding. Later still, it was the absent hum of someone with something else entirely on their mind. I told myself it was normal. We'd been together 9 years. Curiosity fades. Comfort settles in. I told myself I wasn't the most exciting dinner companion. I talked about materials and timelines and crew problems, not exactly gripping stuff for someone who didn't share the work. I told myself she was just being her. I was very good at telling myself things. I thought we were building towards something. I didn't know she had already drawn up the demolition plans. And there's one thing I'll mention now, almost in passing, the way it almost passed me by. 9 years of marriage ended with $150 in cash on a dinner table. I was the one who put it there, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Cole Bennett entered the story the way most disasters do, quietly, and through a side door. Natasha mentioned him on a Wednesday evening in what I can only describe as a deliberately casual way. We were in the kitchen, her scrolling through her phone at the counter, me going over a materials order at the table. She said without looking up that she'd reconnected with someone from high school. An old boyfriend, she said, who'd moved back to Denver after his divorce. She described it as accidental, A comment on a mutual friend's social media post that led to a few nostalgic messages. Nothing remarkable. I looked up from my paperwork. I remember the specific feeling in my chest, not jealousy exactly. More like a low, discordant note struck on a string I hadn't known was tuned. I registered something uncomfortable, something that didn't fit, and then I did what I always do when I can't immediately categorize a feeling. I set it aside. I said something like, "That's a small world," and went back to my order sheet. I had always been the kind of man who trusted until he was given a reason not to. I considered that a virtue. I still do, actually, even now. The problem is that reasonable people can give trust, but unreasonable people can exploit it, and the trust itself becomes the weapon. The reasons arrived slowly, and they arrived with the particular cruelty of things that are easy to explain away. Her phone, once left on countertops and couch cushions and charging cables across 3 different rooms, became a permanent extension of her hand. I didn't notice it immediately. When I did, I noticed it the way you notice something you can't quite name, something that's simply different about a room without being able to say which wall changed. She'd angle the screen away when I walked past, tilting it slightly, naturally, like adjusting for glare. If I hadn't been watching, I never would have clocked it. She started staying later at property showings that had previously wrapped up by 5. Real estate has irregular hours. I'd never questioned her schedule before, never had reason to. But there's a difference between irregular and consistent irregular, and her late evenings were becoming a pattern I could have plotted on a graph. Here's the thing that actually got to me, the detail I still find hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. She became warmer. More affectionate in public, more attentive at dinner, more physically present when we were around other people. She touched my arm at a friend's birthday gathering. She laughed at something I said and left her hand on my shoulder. I initially took this as a good sign, as evidence that whatever ambient restlessness I'd been sensing was lifting, that maybe she was recommitting to something. I would later understand it for what it was: performance, maintenance, the practiced warmth of someone buying time. There was a specific evening that first cracked my composure, though I couldn't have named it that way at the time. We had a dinner reservation we'd made weeks in advance, a place downtown she'd wanted to try. We sat across from each other at a table that had probably cost someone considerable money to design, and she was somewhere else entirely. Her phone was under the table. I could tell by the angle of her shoulders, the slight downward cast of her eyes between sips of wine. She laughed at something, a sharp, involuntary laugh, and quickly angled the screen toward her lap. "Who's that?" I asked. "Client," she said, steady, unbothered, not a flicker. I looked at her hands. Still, no tells. I told myself she was telling the truth. I told myself I was being paranoid, a word I'd never previously associated with myself. I was a man who dealt in concrete and steel and the physics of structures. Paranoia wasn't in the vocabulary. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the dark beside her, beside this woman I had shared a life with for nearly a decade, and I listened to her breathe, and I told myself stories. Reasonable stories. Stories about how marriages have seasons, about how everyone gets distracted, about how a man who trusts his gut in business has to also trust that his gut is sometimes wrong. But men like me don't move on instinct alone. We move on evidence. I'd built everything I had on the principle that feelings are useful data points, but they are not the structure. The structure requires proof. I was about to get some. I didn't know it yet, but she wasn't keeping me in the dark to protect me. She was keeping me calm so I wouldn't notice what she was taking. I'm going to describe this night the way it actually happened, with the kind of deliberate, measured calm that only comes from having relived something so many times that the shock has worn smooth. The night itself was ordinary. Dinner had been quiet. She'd gone up to shower early, said she was tired, had an early showing in the morning. I could hear the water running through the ceiling as I stood in the kitchen, finishing a glass of water, going through a contractor invoice I'd left on the counter earlier. Her phone was beside the coffee maker, unlocked, screen lit. I didn't hover over it. I wasn't looking for anything. I was setting my glass in the sink, passing the counter on my way back to the table. But the notification was right there, bright against the screen, no preview protection, no locked display, and the name Cole was right there, and the words were right there, fully visible. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore. I stood very still for what I think was about 15 seconds. Then I picked up the phone. What I found in the next 7 minutes changed the fundamental composition of my life. I want to be precise about that. Not the way things ended, the ending I controlled. What changed was something structural. Something in the way I understood the preceding years, the way memory recontextualizes when you feed it new information. Every quiet evening, every slightly too warm public gesture, every hum and angled screen and dinner reservation she wasn't really at. The messages went back 4 months, not the clumsy, breathless correspondence of two people confused by unexpected attraction. This was different. This was coordinated. Natasha told Cole the marriage had been a mistake from the beginning. Not that she'd grown apart from me. Not that she was unhappy in the way people are sometimes simply unhappy. She told him it had been a mistake from the beginning, as if our 9 years were a clerical error she was finally correcting. Cole encouraged her to stay patient, to remain warm toward me, to not tip me off until she had accessed and copied our financial records. He referenced specific account types, specific assets. He used the word timeline. He talked about positioning. And then I found the financial conversations. That's the part that changed something in me that I don't have precise language for. The affair I could process, not easily, not without cost, but I could locate it in the category of human failures I understood. People are capable of betrayal, I knew that. What I was not prepared for was the clinical precision of what they'd discussed. Cole had been coaching her. Half the house, half the marital savings, a share of the company's assessed value, spousal support. He had told her in writing, in a message I read twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Don't leave until you're sure you can take 50%. I put the phone down exactly where I'd found it. Exactly the same angle, same distance from the coffee maker edge. I walked to the back porch. It was cold. Denver in autumn has a particular kind of cold, dry, thin, the kind that clears your head because it gives you no other option. I stood out there for a long time. Long enough that the outside lights clicked off on their motion sensor and I was standing in the dark, just the mountain shapes against the sky and the specific silence of a neighborhood after 10 o'clock. When I came inside, Natasha had come downstairs. She was in the kitchen, barefoot, hair damp from the shower, wearing the gray cardigan she always wore in the evenings. She looked at me. I looked at her. I smiled. She smiled back. I sat down at the kitchen table and picked up the contractor invoice and finished reviewing it. She poured herself a glass of water, asked if I was coming to bed soon, and went back upstairs. And I sat there at that table, in the quiet of that house I had built into a home, and I made a decision about who I was going to be for the next several weeks. I was going to be exactly the same man I'd always been. Patient, focused, methodical. I had built a company on those qualities. I would dismantle her plan with them. But there was one more thing in those messages that I hadn't expected, something I found near the bottom of their thread, in an exchange from roughly 6 weeks earlier. Cole had asked Natasha how she was managing the costs. Hotels, dinners, the new furniture he'd been putting in his apartment, and she had replied with 4 words that stopped my blood cold. Don't worry, Sully's paying. She had been using a company credit card, one of 3 tied to Crestline Construction's accounts, to pay for Cole's life, furniture for his apartment, electronics, hotel rooms they'd shared, dinners I'd apparently bought. I hadn't connected it yet, I hadn't pulled the statements, but reading those words, I already knew it was true in my bones. She had been funding her exit with my business. Building a future with Cole using the money that my labor, my crew, my 15 years of early mornings had generated. The following day, I called a private investigator, someone recommended by a business associate of 15 years, someone who understood discretion the way good tradespeople understand craft, not as an add-on but as the foundation of the work. I said nothing to Natasha, not a word, not a shifted energy, not a single moment of pointed silence. I went to work. I came home. I ate dinner she cooked. I asked about her listings. I kissed her cheek when I left in the mornings. The investigator would confirm everything and then some, but that came later. That night, standing in the dark on the back porch, I already knew enough. She was building a life with my money. What she didn't know was that I had spent 15 years learning exactly how to build things and how to make sure they see. Wouldn't be taken apart. What? The weeks after I found those messages were the strangest of my life, and I have had some genuinely strange weeks. I'm talking about the surreal, double-layered quality of living inside a performance while simultaneously constructing something in secret. Every morning I woke up next to a woman who was working to destroy me. I made coffee. I asked about her day. I kissed her cheek when I left for the site. And then I drove to work and spent portions of every day building the legal and financial equivalent of a bear trap. The investigator was excellent. I'll say that without hesitation because competence deserves acknowledgement wherever it lives. Over the following weeks, he produced a file that I can only describe as comprehensive and irreversible. Time-stamped photographs, exterior shots, nothing invasive but legally sufficient and utterly damning. Natasha and Cole outside 3 different restaurants. Cole's apartment building twice. 4 hotels in the metro area, vehicles confirmed by plate, durations confirmed by timestamp. The investigator had also completed a full financial trace of the company credit card, the one I'd suspected from those 4 words in her messages, cross-referenced against Natasha's documented movements and receipts. Every charge, dated and sourced, exactly as I had feared. Cole's new couch. A television I'd apparently purchased. 2 weekends at a hotel 40 minutes outside Denver. One of the same 4 hotels where the photographs had been taken, that I had zero memory of approving. I took the complete file to a divorce attorney my accountant recommended, a woman named Patricia who operates the way I try to operate, with the minimum number of words necessary to achieve the maximum clarity. She reviewed everything across 2 full sessions and did not once express surprise or sympathy. She expressed strategy, which is exactly what I needed. This is where the prenuptial agreement enters the story. My father was a practical man, not warm, not particularly communicative, but practical in the way men of his generation who had lost things tended to be practical. He'd seen people in his circle lose what they'd built, not always to divorce, but often enough. When I told him I was getting married, he said 3 sentences to me. She seems good. I hope it works. Get a prenup. I got a prenup. Natasha had signed it without apparent resistance. I'd assumed at the time that she simply wasn't concerned, that it was a formality she understood the purpose of and accepted without drama. I now suspect she either hadn't read it carefully or had calculated that it was old enough to be irrelevant. Patricia confirmed it was neither old nor irrelevant. The agreement was valid, enforceable, and contained clauses I'd largely forgotten were in there. Specific provisions addressing marital misconduct, financial fraud, and the unauthorized use of separate business assets. Crestline Construction had been founded 6 years before the marriage. It was, in the language of the document, entirely protected. There was also a misconduct clause that would affect spousal support, a clause that, in light of the investigator's file, was now beautifully, precisely activated. We drafted 3 documents simultaneously. The divorce petition, filed by me before her papers were anywhere near a courthouse. A formal repayment demand for every fraudulent business charge, itemized to the decimal, and a filing for dissipation of marital assets, which is the legal term for what Natasha had been doing, deliberately depleting shared or business finances for the benefit of a third party during the marriage. I want to tell you that the hardest part of this chapter was the strategy or the legal complexity or the sheer volume of documentation. It wasn't. The hardest part was the waiting. Natasha kept performing. She cooked dinners that were genuinely good. She was always a better cook than she gave herself credit for. She asked about the Thornfield contract, which was a job she'd heard me mention. She was warm, attentive, present in exactly the way she'd been performing present for the past several months. One evening she suggested we take a vacation. Somewhere warm, she said. Maybe Sedona or the coast. She said she thought we'd been too much in routine and needed something to look forward to. I agreed with enthusiasm. I said that sounded like exactly what we needed. I suggested we look at dates the following weekend. She was still stalling, still following Cole's instructions to stay in place, stay settled, stay positioned until she was ready. Her attorney had already prepared her papers. I would later learn they were complete and sitting in a folder ready to be served. But I had filed my petition first, 10 days before that vacation conversation, and her attorney had no idea. By the time Natasha was rehearsing her dinner speech, my case number was already in the system. The detail I keep returning. G2, the one that I can only describe as a particular kind of poetry, came on a Thursday night about 2 weeks before everything ended. I had gone to bed early, or appeared to. Through the gap in the bedroom door, I watched Natasha move quietly into my home office. She had her phone out. She was photographing documents from the filing cabinet, financial documents, account statements, company records. She thought she was collecting ammunition. She was actually documenting what I had spent an afternoon with my accountant strategically repositioning. The accessible files, the ones she found and photographed with steady-handed confidence, were exactly what I had chosen to leave available. The documents she thought were going to help her attorney build a case were, in several instances, the very records that would demonstrate her own financial misconduct. I lay in the dark and listened to the soft click of her camera, and I thought, she thinks she's building something, but she has no idea what I've already built around her. She set the dinner table the night she planned to end me. I had been setting mine for weeks. She chose a Tuesday. I know that detail seems oddly specific, but it stayed with me, the choice of a Tuesday, an ordinary midweek evening with nothing remarkable attached to it. No anniversary, no milestone. Just a Tuesday she had apparently decided was the right moment to deliver the conclusion she'd been scripting for months. She cooked a real dinner, set the table properly, placemats, the good glasses, the kind of deliberate presentation that I recognized immediately and said nothing about. She poured wine before we sat down. I watched all of it with the calm of a man who has already seen the last act of a play. I sat down, I picked up my fork, I let her lead. She delivered the speech carefully. I could tell she had rehearsed it, not because it was wooden, but because it was too smooth. Real feeling has interruptions. It starts and reverses and finds itself. This was constructed. She described me as a good man, a provider, a stable force. She said those things with something close to genuine feeling, and I think in some fraction of her mind she may have even meant them, the way you can sincerely compliment something you're dismantling. She built carefully toward the conclusion that the marriage had run its course, that she deserved to be happy, that neither of us should remain in something that had stopped serving us both. She never said Cole's name. She placed a folder on the table, her folder, the one her attorney had prepared. Inside, divorce papers demanding half the house, half our marital savings, spousal support, and a professional assessment of Crestline Construction's value with a corresponding claim attached to it. I picked up the first page, read it slowly, let the silence expand. And then I laughed. I don't say that as a performance of dominance. It genuinely came out of me, the specific, involuntary laugh of a man who has been bracing for something for weeks and has just watched it arrive exactly as predicted. There is something absurd in the darkest possible way about watching someone hand you a weapon they've spent months preparing, not knowing you've spent the same months making it useless. Natasha's expression shifted. She had prepared for grief. She had prepared for anger, for desperate negotiation, for tears. She had prepared for the Sullivan she knew, the man who internalizes, who works through feelings in private, who does not erupt. She had not prepared for calm, for laughter, for someone who already knew the ending. The confusion on her face lasted about 3 seconds before it shaded into something else, something closer to the first edge of alarm. I reached beside my chair. I slid my folder across the table. I watched her open it. The divorce petition filed first, already in the system, already with a case number. The messages between her and Cole printed and organized chronologically. The investigators' photographs, restaurants, parking lots, hotel arrivals, hotel departures, Cole's apartment building. Every company credit card charge itemized by date, merchant, and amount with a formal repayment demand attached. The dissipation of assets filing. And the prenuptial agreement with the relevant clauses highlighted in yellow. Marital misconduct, financial fraud, misuse of separate business property. Natasha's face drained of color the way a room drains of light when the power cuts fast and total. She went through the stages in order, and I watched each one with the detachment of someone who has already processed their grief in private and arrived at the other side. First came denial. This isn't what it looks like. You don't have context for those messages. Then deflection. Cole pursued me. I got confused. It was a mistake. Then she moved toward me physically. She came around the corner of the table and put her hand on my arm, and her voice went soft. and unsteady, and she said that she still loved me, that Cole had manipulated her, that she could explain everything if I would just let her. I let her finish. I looked at her hand on my arm. "Natasha," I said, "this was never a love story that went wrong." I said it quietly, the way I say most important things. This was a financial operation, and the operation failed. She started crying, real tears, I think, or as real as anything she'd shown me in the past several months. She said my name twice. She asked what she was supposed to do. I stood up. I went to the kitchen counter. I came back with $150 in cash. I had been carrying it in my jacket pocket for the past several days because I had known this moment was coming, and I had decided well in advance exactly how it would end. I set it on the table beside her folder. I told her it would cover a motel for the night and a rideshare to Cole's apartment. I told her it was the last money she would ever receive from me. She looked at the cash for a long moment, then she looked at me. And then she went upstairs and she packed 2 suitcases. I heard every drawer, every cabinet, every footstep across the floor of the house I had built into a home. She came downstairs with the suitcases and her purse, and she was still crying. She walked out through the front door. I stood at the window, and I watched her car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I felt not triumph, not the way people assume. What I felt was closer to clarity. The specific kind of clarity that arrives when something you've been holding under enormous tension is finally, fully released. Like removing a beam that's been bearing a load it was never designed for, and watching the structure beneath turn out to be fine. The house was quiet for the first time in months. I took the bottle of wine she'd opened and I poured it down the kitchen sink. I rinsed the glass. I turned off the lights in the dining room. And I went to bed. In the morning, I had a company to run. The divorce concluded several months after that Tuesday evening. It did not take long in the end. These things move slowly when people fight, and Natasha's attorney, once presented with the full weight of everything Patricia had assembled, the prenuptial agreement, the misconduct clauses, the financial fraud documentation, the investigator's photographs, advised his client to settle. She settled. The construction company was protected in full by the prenuptial agreement. Crestline Construction was never on the table. The fraudulent credit card charges were repaid through Natasha's portion of the marital savings account, a savings account that, after the dissipation of assets finding was applied, was considerably smaller than she'd anticipated it being. Legal fees ate further into her share. After offsets, repayments, and the applicable misconduct penalties structured into the prenup, her settlement was, in Patricia's precise, understated phrasing, negligible. She waived spousal support. She signed the final papers without contest. Cole did not wait for her. I heard this from a mutual acquaintance who had no idea how sharply I received the information. Once it became clear that Natasha was arriving without half of my fortune, once the legal proceedings made it plain that the operation had not only failed, but had generated a financial loss for her rather than a windfall, Cole ended things. With, I'm told, particular cruelty. He blamed her for dragging him into a legal investigation. He said she had misrepresented how straightforward it would all be. The apartment they had furnished together, with my company's money, item by item over 4 months, was vacated within weeks. I allowed myself exactly 1 moment of something like satisfaction at that information. Then I let it go, because here is what I came to understand in the months after. People like Cole exist in a specific ecosystem. They don't build things. They wait near things other people have built and look for the door that's been left unlocked. And when the door turns out to be locked after all, they simply move on to the next one. Natasha had confused his patience for loyalty. It was never loyalty. It was calculation, the same thing she had been practicing on me, reflected back at her with less consideration for the cost. I kept the house. I kept the company. I promoted 2 long-tenured employees to senior roles I had been considering for over a year and had quietly delayed during the worst months of the marriage, when I couldn't trust my own focus enough to make personnel decisions that would affect people's livelihoods. Marcus and Diane both deserved those roles. I was glad to finally give them. I renegotiated 2 major contracts that had been deferred during the chaos of the preceding months. Both came through better than their original terms, because I was finally able to walk into those meetings with my full attention. Unclo. You did. This is how I want to end this, not with a portrait of a broken man, and not with a celebration of someone else's downfall, because neither of those is accurate. This is the portrait of a man who built something real, watched someone try to take it apart from the inside, and discovered that what he had built was sturdier than even he knew. She wanted 50% of everything I had spent 15 years constructing. 15 years of early mornings, reinvested dollars, and crews I built from nothing. She left with 2 suitcases, $150, and the company of a man who had never intended to share anything with her at all. I kept the rest, and standing in the house on that back porch, in the particular late afternoon light that hits the mountain range in a way I have never managed to adequately describe, I was never more certain it was worth keeping.